Chapter 3. The Double Deuce. Driving down Main Street in Jasper, Missouri felt somewhat like driving back in time to Dalton. He was only 2 hours south of Kansas City, but 1,000,000 miles from New York. The wide street was flanked by shops that had probably been run by members of the same family for generations. They were closed now for the night. It was 20 past 8, which Dalton knew thanks to an old analog clock mounted outside one of those businesses. Above it, in one of the few concessions to modernity on the strip, a green neon sign proclaimed, "Welcome to Jasper." It was one of those places that Dalton had never quite been able to decide whether he would love or hate living in. He guessed he'd soon find out. Just outside of the main part of town, he finally located the Double Deuce and pulled his car into the first empty space out front. The expensive vehicle stood out amongst the battered Fords, Buicks and Chevys around it. His first impression of the place was that it looked more like a biker bar than a nightclub. The lack of love that had been shown to the exterior, including the faded, hand-painted Double Deuce sign above the door, almost made it look like Tillman was trying to keep good people away. A few bikers were sat out front, perched on their hogs and drinking bottles of beer, whilst loudly shouting to each other and anyone else passing by. As Dalton got out of the car, one pointed in his direction and hollered, "Mercedes! Woo!" This drew the attention of the group. Another of the men stared at Dalton and shouted aggressively, "Hey, hotshot! What's wrong with Detroit cars?" He stressed the D, and his comment set the rest of the group to laughing. Some people may have got back in their car at that point and driven off, or engaged the men with a return of aggression, but Dalton just took his time. He closed the car door, put his lit cigarette in his mouth, shrugged off his suede jacket, and walked slowly to the front of the club, eyes never leaving the group. Something in the way he walked, or the look in his eyes, told the bikers that this was a man to be respected, not harassed. One or two even gave him reverent nods. As he neared the main doors to the club, two worn-looking wooden affairs with big pull handles, the first thing he noticed was the lack of doormen. Apparently, anyone was allowed in. Before he reached the steps up to the doors, they suddenly came flying outward, opened by the trucker-capped head of one of the customers from inside. His tumbling body was quickly followed by a large, angry, bearded man wearing cut-off sleeves. "Don't come back, peckerhead!" he yelled in a gruff voice at the man he'd just ejected, who now seemed to have decided that the dirt floor in front of the club was a good place to take a nap. Dalton continued past the angry-looking bouncer and into the club, stopping just inside the entranceway to survey the scene in front of him. The first thing he saw, with a smile, was that he knew the band. He shook his head and thought that luck, or fate, or whatever controlled these things, had a strange sense of humour, as he realised they were playing "On the Road Again," the same song he'd listened to as he'd left New York. The band was seated on a stage, which was not unusual, but the stage was surrounded by a mesh fence made of chicken wire. Dalton quickly saw why the cage was needed, as a couple of rowdy drinkers near the stage finished their drinks and threw the bottles the band's way. They smashed loudly on the fence, and the band just continued on, clearly used to this treatment. If anybody that worked for the club saw this, they had clearly decided that it wasn't a problem. Business as usual. Over the sounds of breaking glass, Dalton next heard the unmistakable sound of violent confrontation. He turned his head to the nearest brick-walled corner, where a small room contained 2 pool tables. He was just in time to see a double denim-wearing customer scream, "You son of a bitch!" before pushing his opponent hard in the chest. The other man, also sporting the blue-on-blue look, responded by swinging a wild haymaker, which missed, before they both tumbled to the floor, rolling and wrestling in the dirt and broken glass. Nobody else in the pool room seemed to interject, either to stop the fracas or to join in themselves. Dalton thought this was a good thing, since quite a few were holding pool cues. He never did think that mixing drinking and any sport that handed you an improvised weapon was a good idea. What he was waiting for, though, were the bouncers to do something about this. He scanned the room to see if he could find them. Most people in the club were just continuing their night, not even looking over to see what was happening, but Dalton did spot one man who seemed to be paying attention. He was young and wearing the same sleeveless styling as the big man who'd been at the door. Dalton assumed that this was what passed for their security uniform here. His presumption was confirmed when he saw the young guy try to attract the attention of an older, also sleeveless man sat on a table beside him. The older guy looked up, saw what was going on, then quickly dismissed it as not his problem, saying, "Fuck 'em, they're brothers." The younger guy still looked anxiously over at the fighting pair, his instincts telling him that it was his job to do something, but his youth telling him that he shouldn't act unless someone senior told him to. Dalton knew that he could train that one. As to the older one, he turned back, with a smile, to the two girls sat beside him at the table, each at least 3 years too young to be in a club with a "No one under 21 allowed" sign on its door. He stroked the cheek of the nearest one, who Dalton reassessed as probably 5 years too young to be in here, and said sweetly, "You know, I get off at 2 and, He took her hand and looked her in the eyes. "I'd just love to get you off about half an hour after that." It was a practiced line, but it worked here, as the jailbait girl bit her lip and looked ready to agree to whatever he asked. Dalton shook his head. This guy clearly had a few tricks when it came to impressing underage girls, but in terms of doing his job, Dalton could tell he was an old dog who wouldn't learn the new tricks that this place needed. He'd have to go. Dalton walked on through the club, surveying the place and finding a litany of problems that he'd have to fix. The main stretch of the bar was lined with drunk patrons sat on bar stools, blocking access to the bar in such a way that anyone wanting to get served would have to fight their way through. Probably literally. One of those in the group was the large doorman from earlier, now with a big glass of beer in his hands. Away from the bar, one of the staff was trying to serve drinks on a tray while being harassed by some drunk assholes. One grabbed her by the waist, causing her to drop her tray and its load of empty glasses onto the floor, which they all found very amusing. Dalton finally found an empty space at the far end of the bar and perched on its padded corner, continuing his observation. At a nearby table, a woman pulled a handful of notes from her bra and tried to pass them to another woman beside her. Dalton knew a drug dealer when he saw one. The dealer pushed the woman's hand away and angrily muttered something. A moment later, the pair walked off to the toilets. The dealer was sleeveless. I wonder if she works here as well, Dalton thought, fairly certain that he knew the answer. Some of these problems would be an easy fix, Dalton decided, but others would need a bit more work. A lot more work. Amid all of this, he noticed something else though. The place was crowded, and alongside all the troublemakers, there were some good people trying to have some good times. That gave him hope that this was a battle that could be won, because for a few moments there, he was getting tempted to tell Tillman that his professional recommendation was to burn the double deuce to the ground and cut his losses. A woman wearing a tight white dress and walking with a swagger that told Dalton that she knew it made her look good, approached the bar. He saw her coming, but he was working, and he kept his eyes off her body and on the room. "Vodka rocks," she ordered. "You got it, baby," the bartender replied. She saw Dalton, giving the stranger an approving look, and leaned back against the bar while she waited, accentuating her ample chest. The man sat beside her at the bar took this as a cue. "Hey, vodka rocks," he slurred, getting to his feet and casually leaning himself against the bar, too close to the woman. "What do you say you and me get nipple to nipple?" Dalton couldn't tell whether the woman had seen the large bouncer behind her potential suitor put down his drink and turn his attention to the man, but he was impressed with how confidently she turned the drunk down. "I can do that without you," she said, turning her back on him. The wannabe Lothario didn't take the rejection well. As she started to walk away, he grabbed her by the arm in an attempt to turn her back to him. But as soon as he did so, his own shoulder was seized by the meaty hand of the bouncer, who spun him around and delivered a big left hook to his gut, doubling him over. There were better ways to deal with the situation, Dalton thought, but at least the bouncer had interjected. That was when, for no good reason that Dalton could see, other than a testosterone-fueled need to do more damage, the bouncer barreled the already incapacitated drunk into the nearest set of tables, customers and all. A few of those that were knocked to the floor looked up angrily, seeming ready to confront whichever asshole had done it. But when they saw the look on the big man's face, they thought better of it. If you were a big enough and mean enough bully, eventually people stopped trying to fight you. And that just made you worse, thought Dalton. "Get him out of here, now!" the bouncer gruffly ordered. Nearby, young Sleeveless and older Sleeveless jumped to their feet and did as they were told. The big guy then walked back over to Dalton, who was still leaning on the bar and now lighting another cigarette. He pointed aggressively in Dalton's face. "If you're not drinking, you're out of here," he told him. Dalton got the feeling that if he said anything in return, the bully was ready to swing for him too, but he knew that now wasn't the time for teaching lessons. He looked the bouncer in the eye while he put his lighter away, and after a moment, the big man walked off. "Hey, don't let him bother you," came a female voice from behind Dalton. "Morgan was born an asshole and he just grew bigger." Dalton turned to look at the woman and saw that it was the waitress he'd seen being harassed earlier. She'd lit a cigarette too and seemed to be taking a break. "I'm Carrie Ann," she said by way of introduction. But Dalton had already turned back to the club. "If you need anything," she started, then tapped on his shoulder to get his attention back on her. "Anything, you just let me know," she finished with a big, genuine smile. Dalton nodded to let her know that he'd heard, then turned back to the room again in an attempt to let her know that he wasn't interested in talking. She didn't get the message. "You got a name?" she asked him. "Yeah," Dalton replied. She waited a few seconds, but when he added nothing else, she continued, "Well, what is it?" Finally, he turned to her. "Dalton," he said simply. She thought for a second, her mouth making an O with her lips while her brain caught up. Then she started to giggle. "Oh my God," she said. "Shit, I heard of you," she laughed. "Carrie Ann," came the bartender's impatient voice behind them. He slammed his hand on the bar to indicate a tray with drinks on it. "What are you waiting for, Christmas? Move!" "Oh, shut up," she moaned quietly, picking up the tray and heading off. "I'm going, Jesus Christ," she grumbled as she left.